I'm joined by Michael Igoe, who's in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and he's been covering the Financing for Development conference. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Adva.
So Michael, what has been the mood this week? It seems it was pretty contentious at the start with some pretty significant debate about the outcome document. What are things like today as the conference is wrapping up?
Yeah, it's been really interesting, Adva. There have been some major sticking points in the negotiations. It wasn't until 9 p.m. last night that the outcome document was actually agreed to. It was finally endorsed today, but people are tired. They've been up later than they were expecting to be. And I don't know if that gives us a sense of any more difficulties ahead for the SDG process and the COP21 process in December. But it's certainly not been the easy walk through negotiations that a lot of people were expecting.
And tell us a little bit about what were some of the major points of contention, what held up this process, and sort of looking forward, what might be the critical issues that could, hold up the SDG process or the COP21 process?
The big one that everyone's heard all about is this idea to create a global tax body. So, the big conversation this week was about how development needs to move beyond official development assistance and really encapsulate funds from the private sector and domestic resources in the form of taxes mobilized by countries themselves. But a lot of developing countries, and particularly civil society organizations, have fired back that it's not fair to ask for more domestic resources from developing countries if you're not, in the same breath, going to commit to cracking down on tax evasion and tax avoidance. So they've been trying to push this idea of a global tax body which would be housed at the UN, and that really held things up. The US in particular, and also the UK, some other global powers were completely opposed to this idea, and developing countries stood their ground for a long time. Ultimately, it was not included in the outcome document. An agreement was settled, but that reservation still remains. The other issue I think that will likely come up again is this idea of common but differentiated responsibility, and whether that language actually factors into some of the subsequent documents and agreements that we see. So this is basically the idea that, yes, while all countries must contribute to a global development agenda, and I think it's worth noting to climate change commitments in the future, those countries have different obligations depending on their development status. So developing countries, as you might expect, wanted to see that specifically recognized in the outcome document, and that was another major sticking point. So there have been a few, and I think it will be interesting to see how this year of international development cooperation proceeds. Ultimately, we arrived at an outcome. I think people are taking heart in that, but certainly it's an interesting tone set here at what was meant to be the kickoff of a major year for reflection on the global development agenda.
My understanding is that a lot of the civil society groups are pretty unhappy with this outcome, and that they're concerned that, developing countries won't have a voice as the process moves forward. This seems like it could be a pretty critical issue. What are you hearing on that front?
Yeah, I think there were some big questions about how inclusive this negotiation process has been throughout. And you hear different things from different people, as you might expect. Those who tend to have a stronger voice in the outcome maintain that this was a fully inclusive process, that they looked to some of the previous work that regional groups of developing countries had produced in the lead up to this conference to shape some of the language in the outcome document, that the negotiations were held among 193 member countries, and that they all are able to stand up and to voice their concerns about them. But then on the other side, and particularly from civil society groups, you do hear that a lot of these decisions were made behind closed doors, that by the time the negotiations actually started, most things had already been hashed out. And that was the other interesting point that some of them have made. I think together with this idea that there wouldn't be a lot of formal, difficult negotiation going on, the structure of the conference itself held off on those negotiations until fairly late. I think it was only midday Tuesday that the real negotiating actually began. So at that point, there was a sense that it was really maybe too late to force anything significant through into the outcome. So those are big questions, and I think it was interesting to see the G77 group of developing countries effectively delay and roadblock the adoption of this outcome document. It's clear that they have the ability to do that, and I think that's something that negotiators will have to consider as they move into conversations about the SDGs and the climate change commitments later this year.
Well, thanks so much, Michael, and we look forward to all the coverage that I'm sure is yet to come from some of the reporting that you've done there in Addis.
Thanks, Adva.